Welcome back to Sleep Histories, where the past drifts gently into your dreams. Tonight we return to one of the greatest sagas in human history, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. A story of ambition and glory, of blood and marble, of men who dreamed of eternity and discovered the price of power. We've journeyed so far together, from the myths of Rome's founding, through the birth of its republic, to the age of blood and ambition where power tore that republic apart. We walked beside Julius Caesar as he reshaped the world, and we watched his heir Augustus build the first great empire. Under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, we saw Rome at its absolute height, a realm of stone roads, aqueducts, and glory stretching from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Arabia. But even the brightest empire casts a long shadow. The marble begins to crack. The gold begins to fade. What was once eternal now trembles on the edge of ruin. From triumph comes tension, from peace decay. And from the heart of this fading empire, a new Rome, scarred, divided, and utterly transformed, will rise again. The 2nd century ended in triumph and order. The emperors called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But peace cannot last forever. Beneath that calm surface, storms were gathering, invisible and unstoppable. The great machine of empire had grown too vast, too heavy, and far too fragile to sustain itself. In its very grandeur lay the seeds of its own destruction. Rome had conquered the known world. Roads bound the empire together like veins through a living body. Cities glimmered with marble, and legions stood guard at every horizon. It seemed eternal, a civilization without equal. But deep within that grandeur, the first cracks had begun to form. At first they were almost invisible, a whisper of trouble at the edges of the empire. In the provinces, legions grew restless. Their loyalty was no longer to the Senate, or even to Rome itself, but to their generals. Ambitious men who had tasted power on distant frontiers began to dream of something greater. Across the Danube and Rhine, new enemies gathered, the Goths, the Franks, and the Vandals. In the east, the Parthians gave way to a new and fiercer power, the Sassanid Persians, who challenged Rome for dominance of the ancient world. And within the empire, the golden economy began to falter. The cost of maintaining legions, roads, and lavish cities drained the treasury. Inflation soared. Coinage was debased. Silver replaced by cheaper metals and faith replaced by fear. For 2 centuries, emperors had been seen as gods. Now they were mortal again, and very, very vulnerable. Then came the storm. Historians would later call it the crisis of the 3rd century. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors would rise and fall, many murdered by their own soldiers. Civil wars raged across the empire. Generals proclaimed themselves emperors, ruling only as long as their armies allowed. Provinces broke away. In the west, a Gallic empire formed under its own ruler. In the east, the city of Palmyra, led by the legendary Queen Zenobia, declared its independence. Rome itself, the heart of the world, trembled. Plague swept across the land, killing farmers and soldiers alike. Fields went untended, cities emptied. For the first time in centuries, people whispered the unthinkable. Could Rome actually fall? Out of this chaos came men hardened by battle. They weren't born to marble halls, but to muddy camps and the roar of war. They were called the soldier emperors, rulers forged by the sword, who rose from the ranks to claim the purple. Among them stood Aurelian, a name few remember today, yet a man who nearly saved Rome from the brink. Aurelian crushed the Gallic rebels in the west, defeated Zenobia's kingdom in the east, and restored the empire's unity. They called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. For a moment, it seemed Rome might heal, but one man could not mend centuries of decay. The system itself was collapsing, too vast to govern, too fragile to defend. After Aurelian's death, chaos returned once more. Then, in the year 284, the empire found a new savior, Diocletian. He was not born noble, he had no famous lineage, but he possessed something Rome had lost: discipline, vision, and a terrifying ruthlessness. Diocletian looked upon the empire and saw a giant that could no longer stand under its own weight. His solution was radical. He divided power. Rome, he declared, was too large for one man to rule. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to govern the western half, while he ruled the east. Below them, 2 junior emperors were appointed to share the burden and ensure succession. This new system was called the Tetrarchy, 4 emperors, 1 empire. He reformed the army, fixed the currency, and set strict limits on prices to curb inflation. He reorganized provinces, strengthened borders, and moved his court away from the old city of Rome, toward the east, where new centers of power were rising. Under Diocletian, the empire stabilized, but this peace came at a price. He ruled with an iron fist. The old freedoms of the republic vanished completely. The emperor was now not merely a ruler, but a living god. In this new age of order, a quiet revolution was stirring, not in palaces but in hidden rooms and humble gatherings. The followers of a crucified man from Judea, the Christians, had spread across the empire. They refused to worship the emperor or the old gods. To Rome's rulers, this refusal was treason. Under Diocletian, the persecution reached its height. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and believers executed. Yet this only made the faith stronger. Their courage lit a spark that would one day transform the empire itself. After 20 years of rule, Diocletian did something no emperor before him had ever dared. He stepped down. Weary and ill, he retired to a magnificent palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he spent his final years tending his gardens. But without his iron hand, the Tetrarchy began to crumble. Rival emperors rose and fell, each marching to war. From this chaos, one man emerged, ambitious, calculating, and guided, he claimed, by a divine vision. His name was Constantine. Constantine's story began in blood, raised amid the violence of civil wars. He was a soldier, a strategist, and above all, a survivor. In the year 312, on the eve of a great battle for control of the empire, he looked to the heavens and saw a sign, a cross of light blazing against the sky, and the words, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. The next day at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine triumphed. He credited his victory to the God of the Christians. In the years that followed, he did what no emperor had dared. He legalized Christianity, ending centuries of persecution. The faith of martyrs became the faith of emperors. But Constantine's vision went beyond religion. He saw that the ancient capital of Rome was no longer fit to rule a divided empire. Its glory was now a memory. So he built a new capital, a city between two worlds. On the shores of the Bosporus he raised Constantinople, the new Rome. Its walls gleamed with gold, its churches with mosaics of light. It was a city destined to endure long after the old empire crumbled. Under Constantine, Rome was transformed, politically, spiritually, and geographically. This was no longer the Rome of senators and legions, of pagan temples and marble triumphs. It was now an empire of faith, ruled by emperors who prayed as well as conquered. The cross had replaced the eagle. The Colosseum grew silent. And though the empire would endure for another century in the west, and 1,000 years more in the east, the world of ancient Rome was gone. In its place stood something new, the foundation of medieval Europe, the seed of Christendom and a legacy that would echo through history. Thank you for joining us on this journey tonight. If you've enjoyed drifting through the ages with us, please like this video. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with peace. The year is 235 AD. On a distant frontier, the Emperor Severus Alexander lies dead, murdered by his own troops. His death is not an isolated event. It is the spark that ignites a firestorm. For the next 50 years, the Roman Empire will be plunged into a maelstrom of civil war, foreign invasion, and economic collapse. This is the story of the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the world's greatest empire teetered on the brink of total annihilation. Imagine a world where the highest office in the land is also the most dangerous. In the half-century following Alexander's death, More than 25 men would claim the title of emperor. Most would not die peacefully. They were soldiers, senators, and ambitious generals, each rising to power on a wave of promises, only to be cut down by the very swords that elevated them. In one single chaotic year, 238 AD, 6 different men would wear the imperial purple, each one a fleeting monarch in an empire consuming itself. The average reign was a mere 2 years. Loyalty became a commodity, sold to the highest bidder, and the emperor's personal guard, the Praetorians, became the ultimate kingmakers and kingbreakers. The purple robe, once a symbol of supreme authority, had become little more than a funeral shroud. While Rome tore itself apart from within, its enemies gathered at the gates. The long fortified borders, the limes, which had for centuries held back the tide of barbarians, began to crumble. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Alemanni, and Franks saw their chance. They poured across the frontiers in waves, not just for plunder, but to settle. Roman legions depleted and constantly recalled to fight in yet another civil war for yet another claimant to the throne, could not hold them back. Cities that had known peace for generations were sacked and burned, farms were abandoned, and the countryside became a landscape of fear. In the east, a new and formidable rival had risen from the ashes of the old Parthian Empire. The Sassanid Persians, led by ambitious kings like Shapur-the-Ern, launched massive invasions into Rome's eastern provinces. They were not raiding parties. They were sophisticated armies, capable of defeating Roman legions in open battle and besieging major cities. In a moment of ultimate humiliation, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured in battle by Shapur in 260 AD. He would die in captivity, a living symbol of Rome's broken pride. The Sassanids didn't just raid, they conquered, striking deep into Syria and Anatolia, threatening the very heart of Rome's eastern wealth. The constant state of war created a political vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. With the central government in chaos, local leaders took matters into their own hands. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a fundamental fracturing of the Roman world. In the West, a general named Postumus, tired of the chaos emanating from Rome, declared his own Gallic Empire in 260 AD. Covering Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, this breakaway state was not an anti-Roman movement. In fact, it was the opposite. Postumus and his successors saw themselves as the true defenders of Roman civilization in the West, creating their own senate, their own consuls, and their own currency. They provided the stability and security that the Central Empire could no longer guarantee. For 14 years, the Gallic Empire stood as a separate, functioning Roman state. Simultaneously in the east, an even more spectacular breakaway state emerged. The desert city of Palmyra, a wealthy hub on the caravan routes, had long been a loyal Roman ally. But under the leadership of its brilliant and ambitious queen Zenobia, Palmyra saw an opportunity. Following the murder of her husband, who had been a loyal Roman client king, Zenobia took control. She was no mere regent. She was a scholar, a general, and a stateswoman who claimed descent from Cleopatra. She leveraged Palmyra's wealth and military strength to carve out her own empire. By 270 AD, her forces had conquered Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, and much of the Near East. Like the Gallic emperors, Zenobia presented herself not as a rebel, but as a restorer of order, the true protector of the Roman East. For a brief, dazzling moment, the Roman Empire was split into 3 competing pieces, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the legacy of Augustus. The once unified Mediterranean world was shattered. As if civil war and invasion weren't enough, a silent, invisible killer stalked the land. Known as the Plague of Cyprian, after the Bishop of Carthage who documented its horrors, this devastating pandemic swept through the empire from around 249 to 262 AD. We don't know for sure what the disease was, perhaps smallpox or a hemorrhagic fever, but its effects were catastrophic. At its peak, it was said to be killing up to 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. It ravaged cities and countryside alike, decimating the population. Armies were hollowed out not by battle but by sickness. Farms fell fallow as the farmers died, leading to widespread food shortages. The plague didn't just kill people, it attacked the very fabric of society. It drained the empire of its manpower, its taxpayers, and its soldiers, weakening it at the precise moment it needed its full strength to survive. This perfect storm of war, plague, and political instability triggered a complete economic meltdown. To pay the soldiers who kept them in power, emperors resorted to a desperate measure, debasing the currency. They minted more coins, but with less and less precious metal. The denarius, once a reliable silver coin, became little more than a bronze piece with a thin silver wash. The result was hyperinflation. Prices soared, and people's life savings became worthless. Confidence in money evaporated. Trade, the lifeblood of the empire, ground to a halt. Why risk a perilous journey if the coins you received were worthless? The complex, interconnected economy of the Roman world began to break down into a patchwork of local, subsistence economies. People abandoned cities for the relative safety of the countryside, seeking protection from wealthy landowners on their large, fortified villas. This was the beginning of a process that would, over centuries, transform the Roman world into the feudal society of the Middle Ages. The empire was not just breaking apart geographically, it was collapsing from the inside out. And yet, in this darkest hour, Rome did not fall. The idea of Rome, the res publica, was more resilient than any single emperor or any single crisis. Even as the empire fractured, the machinery of government, battered and bruised, continued to function. Governors collected taxes, judges held court, and engineers maintained the aqueducts. The Roman legions, though stretched thin and often fighting each other, never fully broke. They continued to march under the eagle standard, fighting to defend a home they still believed in. It was from the ranks of these very soldiers that salvation would finally emerge. A series of tough, pragmatic, and ruthless emperors, often from humble provincial backgrounds, rose to power. Known as the soldier emperors, men like Claudius Gothicus and, most importantly, Aurelian, were warriors first and politicians second. Their mission was simple: restore the empire. Aurelian, reigning for just 5 years from 270 to 275, embarked on a whirlwind campaign of reconquest. He defeated the Alemanni in Italy, drove the Goths back across the Danube, and then turned his attention to the breakaway empires. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he crushed Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire and then peacefully reintegrated the Gallic Empire back into the fold. He earned the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. He had, against all odds, stitched the empire back together. Aurelian's work was continued and consolidated by later emperors, most notably Diocletian, who would fundamentally reorganize the empire, creating a new system of governance called the Tetrarchy to manage its vast and troubled territories. The crisis was over, but the Roman world was forever changed. It emerged from the fire scarred and transformed. The power of the emperor was now more absolute, more militaristic. The economy was more regulated, the society more rigid. The Principate, the system established by Augustus where the emperor was the first citizen, was dead. In its place was the Dominate, where the emperor was lord and master, Dominus. The crisis of the 3rd century was a near-death experience for Rome. It exposed the deep-seated weaknesses in its political, military, and economic systems, but it also demonstrated the incredible resilience of the Roman idea. The empire had stared into the abyss and, through sheer force of will, had pulled itself back. It had survived, but it was no longer the same empire. The foundations of the late Roman and ultimately the Byzantine Empire were forged in the crucible of this 50-year crisis. It was a brutal, bloody, and chaotic chapter in Rome's story, but it was also a testament to its incredible capacity for survival and reinvention. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to one of history's most turbulent times. If you found this story, can you hear that? In the distance, church bells toll, their sound mingling with the faint call of a muezzin from across the sea. Two faiths, two worlds, meeting on the edge of dawn. Somewhere nearby, a hammer strikes stone, the sound echoing across the Bosporus. Each blow builds something that will outlast empires, a city rising from vision and faith. This is the story of how a divided world was reforged. The massive empire that Diocletian had split just to save it was now being pieced back together, not by fear, but by faith. And at the center of it all stood one man, Constantine the Great. Born into a time of civil war and uncertainty, Constantine was no stranger to chaos. His father was a ruler in the western provinces, one of Diocletian's Caesars, and Constantine grew up surrounded by marching legions and constantly shifting allegiances. When Diocletian abdicated, the fragile system of 4 rulers, the Tetrarchy, crumbled into bitter rivalry. Constantine emerged as one of several men fighting for the title of emperor, but where others saw only a path to power, he saw a date with destiny. The year is 312 CE. Rome, once again, is at war with itself. At the Milvian Bridge, on the outskirts of the ancient capital, Constantine prepares to fight his rival, Maxentius, for control of the Western Empire. The night before the battle, legend tells us, Constantine looked toward the setting sun and saw something that would change history forever. There, in the sky, a radiant cross of light appeared, shining brighter than any star. Beneath it were the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you will conquer. Constantine took it as an omen from the Christian God, whose followers had suffered for centuries under the old pagan order. He commanded his soldiers to paint the symbol of the Chi Rho, the sacred monogram of Christ, upon their shields. When the armies clashed the next morning, Constantine's forces were victorious. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River, and the gates of Rome swung open for their new emperor. That day marked the beginning of a transformation as monumental as any conquest. For the first time in history, the empire of the Caesars bowed to the cross. In the years that followed, Constantine didn't just reshape the empire with the sword, he reshaped it with belief. In 313 CE, he co-issued the Edict of Milan, declaring religious tolerance throughout the realm. The age of persecution was over. Christians were now free to worship, to build churches, and to hold positions of power. Where Diocletian had ruled through fear, Constantine sought to rule through unity. He called bishops from across the empire to settle disputes in doctrine, most famously at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. There, amid heated debate and fervent prayer, the foundations of the Christian church were solidified. The faith that had started in secret, whispered in catacombs and caves, was now the faith of emperors. But let's be clear, Constantine was no simple saint. He remained a ruler of iron will, a brilliant strategist and at times a ruthless master of his empire. He understood that to save Rome he had to move beyond its past, to build something new, untouched by the corruption and decay that haunted the old capital. Rome, the eternal city, had long been the heart of the empire, but by Constantine's time it was a heart grown weak. Its senators were powerful but complacent. Its temples still clung to the old gods. And its location, far from the eastern frontiers where wealth and trade now flowed, made it more of a symbol than a strategic center of power. So, Constantine chose a new home for his empire, a small Greek city called Byzantium, situated on the narrow strait that connects Europe and Asia. There, overlooking the shimmering waters of the Bosporus, he envisioned a city worthy of his new Rome, a city of light, faith, and empire. He renamed it Nova Roma, the New Rome, though the world would come to know it as Constantinople. Its streets were lined with magnificent marble colonnades. Its gates were crowned with golden domes. Its grand forum held statues of emperors past, and at its very heart rose a colossal statue of Constantine himself, crowned with a halo of 7 rays, a subtle nod, perhaps, to the sun god once worshipped in the empire he had left behind. In 330 CE, Constantine officially declared it the empire's new capital. Rome, the mother of nations, had given birth to her heir. Power had shifted east, moving from the fading glory of the old world to the promise of a new one. Under Constantine, the Roman Empire became something entirely different. It was still vast, still powerful, but its very soul had changed. It was no longer the empire of Jupiter and Mars, of gladiators and sacrifices. It had become the empire of Christ, a realm where bishops stood beside generals and cathedrals rose where temples once stood. Art, law, and politics all began to reflect this massive transformation. Crosses adorned military banners that once bore the Roman eagle. Emperors began to rule by divine right, not just by military might. The very idea of empire, one ruler, one faith, one God, would echo for 1,000 years in the kingdoms that followed. And yet, in this moment of unification, the seeds of future division were already being sown. By elevating Constantinople, Constantine had done more than just move the capital. He had shifted the balance of the world. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would become rich, urban, and enduring, thriving for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire, left behind and weakened by invasions and poverty, would eventually collapse into ruin. In 337 CE, after more than 3 decades of rule, Constantine fell ill. On his deathbed, he was finally baptized as a Christian, a fitting end to the life of the man who had changed the empire and soul. When he died, his body was placed within the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, surrounded by 12 empty sarcophagi, one for each of the apostles, as if he too were counted among them. The world he left behind was no longer the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. It was a different Rome, spiritual, enduring, and forever transformed. The empire of iron and marble had become one of light and faith. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. Imagine the scene. The roar of warriors fills the night. Fire crackles through narrow, ancient streets. Somewhere in the darkness, a child cries, an echo of a world ending. This is the story of the fall of Rome, an empire that once seemed eternal, brought to its knees not by a single blow but by 1,000 cuts. For centuries, Rome was the center of the world, but along its vast frontiers, pressure was building. From the north and east came storms of people, Goths, Vandals, Huns. These weren't just names, they were omens whispered in fear. For generations they had watched Rome, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, trading with its merchants and even fighting in its legions. But the winds of change were blowing, and they were no longer coming as guests. They were coming as conquerors. The empire that Emperor Constantine had reforged was mighty, but its foundations were fragile. Thousands of miles of fortifications, rivers, walls, and forts marked the line between Roman civilization and what they called the barbarian world. Beyond this line lived restless tribes, driven by hunger, ambition, and a force even greater than those, survival. Far to the east, a new power had risen on the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. They were fierce nomadic horsemen who swept across the plains like a wildfire, pushing other peoples before them in a great wave of migration. The Visigoths, terrified and desperate to escape the Huns' wrath, fled to the borders of the Roman Empire and begged for refuge. In a moment of what seemed like compassion, Rome agreed. But this alliance was poisoned from the start. Corrupt Roman officials saw the desperate refugees not as people to be helped, but as a resource to be exploited. They withheld food, demanded outrageous bribes for basic shelter, and treated the Goths with contempt and cruelty. Starvation and humiliation are powerful catalysts for rebellion, or desperation boiled over into rage. In the year 378, near the city of Adrianople, the Visigoths rose up against their Roman hosts. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for Rome. The seemingly invincible Roman legions were shattered. The Emperor Valens himself was cornered and killed, some say burned alive in a farmhouse as the Gothic warriors closed in. The Battle of Adrianople wasn't just a defeat. It was a message to the entire world. The legions could be beaten. Rome could bleed. The decades that followed were a slow, agonizing decline. Peace was a distant memory. The empire's power waned, its armies thinned, and its treasury was perpetually drained by endless wars and political instability. Emperors came and went, often puppets installed by powerful generals rather than chosen by law. A great divide was growing. The Western Empire, centered in Rome, grew poorer and more vulnerable, while the Eastern Empire, with its capital in the heavily fortified city of Constantinople, grew stronger and more secure behind its golden walls. Among the Visigoths, a new leader emerged, Alaric. He was cunning, ambitious, and relentless. He had once fought for Rome, hoping to earn a high command within its prestigious ranks, but Rome, in its arrogance, denied him the honor he felt he deserved. Betrayed and rejected, Alaric's loyalty curdled into a thirst for vengeance. If he couldn't be a Roman general, he would be Rome's destroyer. In 410, Alaric and his Visigoth army did the unthinkable. They marched into Italy itself and laid siege to the Eternal City. For over 800 years, no foreign army had breached the walls of Rome. Inside, panic turned to famine. Senators pleaded for mercy, priests held desperate prayers, but the city was starving. Then, on a fateful summer night, the Salarian Gate was opened. Some say by traitors, others by desperate slaves. The Visigoths poured into Rome. The world held its breath. For 3 days, the city that had once ruled the known world burned and bled. The magnificent marble temples of Jupiter and Venus were looted. Gold was stripped from statues, and priceless treasures were hauled away in carts. A thick plume of smoke rose above the Tiber River like a vast funeral shroud. And yet, it wasn't the wholesale slaughter many had feared. Alaric, a Christian, commanded his men to spare the city's great churches, like the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. But the psychological shock was far greater than the physical damage. St. Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, captured the horror of the moment. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The myth of an eternal, invincible Rome was shattered forever. The fall of the city was not the end of the storm. It was the beginning of the flood. One after another, tribes from the north swept across the weakened western provinces, carving out new kingdoms from the corpse of the empire. The Vandals crossed from Spain into the rich province of North Africa, seizing the vital port of Carthage and building their own naval kingdom. From there, their pirate fleets terrorized the Mediterranean, even daring to sail up the Tiber and sack Rome for a second time in 455. Meanwhile, the Franks settled in Gaul, laying the foundations for the future kingdom of France. Across the Channel, the Angles and Saxons crossed into the misty island of Britain, pushing the native Romano-Britons west and forging the lands that would one day become England. And then, from the plains of Pannonia, modern-day Hungary, came the most feared of all, the Huns, led by their terrifying king, Attila. Known to the Romans as the Scourge of God, his armies moved with the speed and devastation of a natural disaster. Cities paid him massive tributes of gold just to be spared. Villages vanished overnight. In 452, Attila's banners were spotted approaching Italy, and a fresh wave of panic swept through what was left of the empire. But just as he seemed poised to march on Rome, fate intervened. According to legend, Pope Leo I met with Attila and miraculously persuaded him to turn back. More likely, a combination of disease, famine in his own army, and the threat of an attack from the Eastern Roman Empire forced his retreat. The Huns withdrew, and within a year, Attila was dead, his own empire collapsing as quickly as it had risen. Even with Attila gone, Rome was a shadow of its former self. Its armies no longer conquered. They bargained, retreated, and disintegrated. Its emperors no longer ruled with authority. They were powerless figures, often children, who pleaded with barbarian warlords and then vanished into obscurity. The final act, when it came, was not a dramatic battle, but a quiet, anticlimactic end. In the year 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leading what was left of the Roman army in Italy, simply deposed the last Western Roman emperor. His name, ironically, was Romulus Augustulus, a pathetic echo of Rome's founder Romulus and its first great emperor Augustus. He was just a boy. Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to the emperor in Constantinople, signaling that a separate emperor in the West was no longer needed. There was no great war, no thunder of legions defending the capital, just a quiet transfer of power. The Western Roman Empire was gone, The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly another 1,000 years. But the old Rome, the Rome of Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan, had finally fallen. The child who once cried in the dark now lived in a different world, a world of new kingdoms, new languages, and new faiths. The bright, clear light of the classical age had dimmed. In its place, a new dawn was breaking, a dawn that seemed darker, rougher, but was also filled with the seeds of a new beginning, the world we now know as the Middle Ages. Imagine the wind whistling through broken columns, the cry of a crow echoing over ruins where senators once debated and emperors dreamed. The marble of the Roman Forum, once gleaming, now lies cracked beneath weeds. The statues of the gods, their faces worn by time, gaze silently into a world that is fading away. This is the 5th century, and the Western Roman Empire is no longer a beacon of order but a ghost of its former majesty. The legions that once guarded its vast borders are scattered or gone. The treasury that once overflowed with gold from conquered lands now lies empty, and the emperors who once commanded nations can barely command their own guards. The empire's heart was weak, but the world around it was on fire. From the north came the Goths and Vandals, the Franks and the Lombards, tribes who no longer feared Rome, but sought to carve their own kingdoms from its dying corpse. To the east, Constantinople, the new Rome, looked on with a mix of pity and resolve, its own emperors choosing survival over nostalgia for a world that was already lost. The map of the West had fractured into 1,000 pieces. Gaul was lost to the Franks. Britain, long since abandoned, had faded into chaos and legend. Spain was divided among Visigoths and Suebi. And North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, had fallen to the Vandals whose ships now ruled the Mediterranean, plundering what was left of Roman coasts with impunity. In Italy itself, power shifted like sand in the desert. The generals who were supposed to defend Rome were no longer Romans. They were mercenaries, men of Germanic birth who fought not for the glory of the empire, but for coin. One of them was Orestes, a seasoned commander who seized control of the imperial court. He did what many ambitious men had done before him. He placed his own son, Romulus Augustulus, upon the throne. But Romulus was just a boy, perhaps 16 years old, far too young to understand that he had been crowned ruler of an empire that had already vanished. The final act came in 476 CE. A general named Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain serving in what remained of Rome's army, marched on the capital. He had a simple demand: land for his people, the Heruli, right here in Italy. When Orestes refused, Odoacer's army rose in rebellion. Ravenna, the last imperial capital, fell swiftly. Orestes was captured and executed. When Odoacer entered the city, the boy emperor was brought before him. Imagine the scene: a young man, trembling and silent, wearing a crown that no longer held any power. But Odoacer, in a surprising act of mercy, did not kill him. He saw no threat in this boy, no reason to spill more Roman blood. Instead, he gently removed the diadem from the young emperor's head and sent it east to Constantinople, to the Emperor Zeno. It was a clear, unmistakable message. There would be no more emperors in the West. With that simple act, 1,000 years of Roman imperial history in the West came to an end. The Western Roman Empire was gone. There was no epic battle, no city burned to the ground. No trumpet sounded a final retreat, and no crowd wept in the Forum. The fall of Rome didn't come with fire and fury, but with a profound silence, the slow, quiet fading of an age. In the streets, life went on. Farmers still sold their grain in the markets. Children still played beneath the shadow of the colossal aqueducts. But something immense, something foundational had vanished, the idea of a single unified Rome that ruled the world. In its place, something new began to grow. The western provinces transformed into the kingdoms we recognize today, of Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Lombards. The language of Rome, Latin, didn't die. It lingered, evolving and reshaping itself into the Romance languages of the future: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Its laws, its roads, its Christian faith, all of these survived, even as the empire itself did not. And far to the east in Constantinople, the Roman dream lived on for another 1,000 years. There, emperors still wore the imperial purple, legions still marched under Roman eagles, and scholars still proudly called themselves citizens of Rome. But the Rome of the West, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, of the Colosseum and the Senate, had passed into the realm of history. Centuries would pass, and new empires would rise, each one claiming to be Rome's rightful heir. The Byzantines, the Holy Roman Emperors, even the Tsars of Russia, all would borrow the name, the titles, and the powerful dream of Rome. It's because Rome had become more than just a city or a state. It had become an idea, an ideal of order, power, and civilization, one that simply refused to die. Its magnificent architecture inspired cathedrals and palaces. Its legal codes shaped the laws of modern nations. Its vision of order and power echoed through the courts of kings and the halls of parliaments for centuries to come. And its stories, tales of breathtaking triumph, deep corruption, unparalleled glory, and devastating loss, would be told and retold for millennia. So next time you imagine those ruins, listen closely. As the wind moves through the broken columns of the Forum, you can almost hear the whispers of that vanished world, the clatter of sandals on stone, the murmur of senators debating policy, the laughter of children playing by the Tiber River. Rome is gone, and yet not gone at all. For wherever people build great cities, write just laws, or dream of creating something that will last, there, in some quiet corner of the human spirit, Rome still lives. The fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't the end of history. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. A hush settles over the ruins. Moonlight spills across broken marble, turning dust into silver. Somewhere a breeze stirs, soft, ancient, eternal, carrying with it the memory of an empire that once ruled the world. For more than 1,000 years, Rome shaped the destiny of humankind. From a cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber, it grew into a city of marble, then into a world-spanning empire. It conquered and created, enslaved and enlightened. It brought roads, laws, and architecture to lands that had never known such wonders, and yet, in its pursuit of greatness, it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. But Rome did not truly die. Even as its walls crumbled and its banners fell, its ideas endured. The Latin language became the root of Europe's tongues. Roman law became the foundation of justice. Its engineers built bridges and aqueducts that still stand. Its vision of order, citizenship, and civilization echoed through the centuries. When we speak of empire, of governance, of the rise and fall of nations, we are still speaking in some way of Rome. Every republic that followed borrowed from its Senate. Every capital that dreamed of eternity built in its image, from Constantinople to London, from Paris to Washington, D.C. Rome's faith, too, outlived its emperors. In the ashes of the old temples rose cathedrals and basilicas, carrying forth not Jupiter or Mars, but Christ. The cross replaced the eagle, yet both symbols reached for heaven, proof that Rome's spirit had merely changed its shape. And in the East, the Byzantine Empire would endure for another 1,000 years, preserving the art, law, and legacy of the Caesars until even its last embers faded in 1453. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, the torch passed again, and still the idea of Rome burned on. Historians call it the fall of Rome. But perhaps it was not a fall, only a transformation. Empires collapse, but civilizations evolve. Marble turns to dust, but ideas live on in flesh and memory. Even now, when you walk through a great city, see the arches, the columns, the domes, you are walking through echoes of Rome. When you read a law, speak a Latin word, or dream of greatness that endures beyond a lifetime, you are, in some quiet way, part of the same story. Rome was never just a place. It was a mirror, reflecting both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human ambition. It showed what we can build and what we can destroy. So the empire fell. The emperors are gone. The legions sleep beneath the soil they once conquered. But their world lives on, in the stones, the stories, and the souls of those who remember. And perhaps, If you stand among the ruins at dusk, if you listen closely enough to the wind moving through the ancient arches, you might hear it, the faint echo of 1,000 voices whispering through time. Roma aeterna est. Rome is eternal. And so, our story drifts into silence. Rome has fallen, yet her echo endures, carried on the wind, in our words, and in the cities we build. If this journey through time helped you drift a little closer to sleep, if you felt the whisper of history beneath the stars, then stay with us. There are countless stories still waiting to be told, empires yet to rise and civilizations yet to fade. Each night, we remember them, together. If this story helped you drift into the past tonight, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. There are so many more stories waiting for us where history dreams again.